Hey folks, Bret here. I wanted to take a crack at analyzing the Steven Crowder situation. For those who don't know, Crowder has a very popular YouTube channel with more than 3 million subscribers, which was recently demonetized by Google for what it said were violations of its terms of service. In particular, Crowder mocked Vox reporter Carlos Maza, who is gay, and he did so in a way that was quite mean-spirited. Now, many have pointed out that others have done far worse on YouTube and not had their channels demonetized, so what's going on? Well, the key concept is selective enforcement, or what I call the principle of the low posted speed limit. You can imagine a town in which a speed limit was posted so low that people routinely violate it as they pass through town, and the enforcement authority can decide if it wants to pull over black people or gay people or Jews or hippies or whatever it doesn't like. The law itself isn't biased, but the enforcement makes it as if it were. So, in one sense, because Crowder is such a big target, he is facing a kind of enforcement that may not be seen elsewhere. Now, there is an important issue here which has to do with the question of speech. Is Steven Crowder engaged in an act of free speech that is in some way protected? Well, technically not. The First Amendment does not apply to Google because Google is a private corporation. On the other hand, the First Amendment was designed to protect free expression. The reason that it is very specifically limited to governmental interference is that the founders, in particular, feared governmental tyranny. We don't know what they would have thought about tech platforms, but my guess is the very same logic that led them to build multiple protections into the U.S. Constitution against government overreach would have caused them, if they had understood the way Silicon Valley would function, to protect us also from these tech platforms and their disproportionate power. But the founders were simply not gods, and they couldn't look forward in such a way. And so they left us with a situation in which we know what they were trying to protect us from, but the map they gave us was not sufficient to do the job in the 21st century. We should also recognize when we talk about these corporations that they are not one thing. In fact, we can recognize several different layers at work in these processes. There is the speech layer, the part of Twitter or YouTube where we, the public, talk to each other. There is the algorithm layer, which decides what we see is in general functioning in an automatic way, but it may be primed to have certain biases within it. And then there's the corporate layer, where something that we can't engage with talks to itself and decides what it is trying to accomplish. Presumably, the corporate layer is divided. There may be a big difference between the people who are attempting to steer the corporation in the direction of profitability and, let's say, the Truth and Safety Committee within the corporation that may have a different agenda. Unfortunately, we don't get much of a window into the discussion between those two layers, but it is worth keeping in mind that as Google takes action, it may not be of one mind. Let us assume for the moment that most of us believe in the concept not only of free speech, but in the value that is being protected by the First Amendment, free expression. Some of us have been cast as free speech absolutists, and in fact, I've used that term with reference to myself. Others, like my brother Bret Weinstein, has argued he's not a free speech absolutist because he is concerned about certain things that might be protected by such an unnuanced view. Now, we can debate the merits of free speech absolutism, but even those of us who favor it don't do so naively. The fact is, free speech absolutism results in the protection of some things that we would much prefer not be protected. The reason that we fall out as free speech absolutists in any event is because there is no way to draw the line so that it does not do damage. And I think I speak for most of those in this camp when I say what we have recognized is that the harm done by attempting to draw the line tends to be much greater than the benefit of drawing the line. And so in the end, we are better off accepting that harm than attempting to create a border where we will eventually do violence. If you don't know what I'm talking about, consider the question of dead naming. When a person has transitioned from one sex to the other, there is a principle, I believe it is part of Twitter's terms of service at this point, that dead naming them is considered a violation. Dead naming is simply the act of invoking the name that somebody had before they went through their transition. Now, in principle, I would agree that it's not a very nice thing to do. And in general, when somebody says they want to be called by a particular name from here on out, I see no reason that we shouldn't honor that request. On the other hand, there are places where we must not honor that request, and we are beginning to lose sight of this. I noticed one particular instance recently when Julian Assange was arrested. That arrest caused a spate of news reports to come out, and those news reports tended to recount the history of WikiLeaks. I noticed in the New York Times and in Rolling Stone in particular, those reports said that Chelsea Manning had handed documents to Julian Assange, which had resulted in Manning's prosecution. Now, that's not a description of what took place in history. In fact, Bradley Manning was the person who was convicted of having handed secret documents to Julian Assange, not Chelsea Manning. The transition happened after he had already been convicted. For the New York Times and Rolling Stone to report that Chelsea Manning had done this is simply an inaccurate reporting of the facts. On the other hand, it might be argued that my even invoking the name Bradley Manning was somehow a violation of the terms of service of the entity I would use to distribute the video. Well, that can't be. We have to get back to a state where even if I wish to honor Chelsea Manning's request to be called Chelsea Manning, when we get to questions of history, I am allowed to invoke her former identity as Bradley Manning, as it is an important historical fact and an unchangeable one. So let's move on to the question of Steven Crowder. In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that months ago, Steven invited me onto his program, and I considered going. I asked him if we could do it in person because I felt like there were some difficult things that I had to say to him and that I didn't want to do it over a remote link. He didn't want to do it in person, and so I let it go at that. The fact is, I do think those things still need to be said. What Steven did to Carlos Maza is pretty nasty stuff, and it's not the only time he's done such a thing. A year or so ago, I saw a video in which Steven sent a Confederate into a meeting of trans people, and the Confederate filmed his harassment of them, presumably for comedic purposes. But the whole thing struck me as so mean-spirited that I couldn't see any justification for it. These people were not acting in public in some way that required commentary. These people were simply meeting to discuss things, and it wasn't really Steven's right to disrupt that. Surely people have a right to gather and have discussions that are private without Steven intervening. On the other hand, having the tech platforms police etiquette is turning into an absolute nightmare, and there's no way it's going to end well. In the end, what's going to happen is whatever rules they lay down are going to be used by bad actors, and they are going to run roughshod over the rest of us. So what I'm going to suggest is that we do something else. Steven, I'm really talking to you here. I get a lot out of what you do on YouTube. In particular, I'm very fond of the thing you do where you set up a card table on a college campus and you have a principle stated on a sign and then you ask people to convince you otherwise. I think that's a very valuable exercise. It happens I disagree with you a lot of the time, but it is very informative to watch people challenge you. And frankly, I think it's quite humanizing. But some of the stuff you do where you give people a hard time over their sexual orientation or other such stuff, I just don't see any reason for it. And I think, frankly, it's time for you to outgrow it. So in any case, I'd be willing to talk to you about this, but I hope you'll take it to heart and think about just simply not being a dick. Hey, folks. If you like this video, click like, subscribe to the channel, and if you feel like supporting the creation of more content like this, head on over to my Patreon page and sign up at whatever level feels comfortable.